Director of Programming for NPR News. From COVID-19 to climate change to the economic downturn to injustices in our policing and legal system, the most pressing issues we face in America are disproportionately affecting people of color. So for this series, we're bringing together a diverse group of authors to talk about their books, which all provide unique insights on America's racial divide. We have poets Reginald Dwayne Betts and M. Scott Momaday and novelists Chang Rae Lee and Naima Coster. You can get more information on this series, links to local booksellers, and tickets to all Talking Volumes events at mprevents.org. Tonight, we will have a 60-minute in-depth interview with the author, followed by a panel discussion presented by our partners at Star Tribune. If you haven't had a chance, check out the author profile at startribune.com. You can also listen to the radio broadcast of this interview on NPR News Friday at 9 a.m. We'd like to thank our generous sponsors, Thomson Reuters, for their support. Now, please welcome award-winning journalist and your host for this evening, Carrie Miller.
I'm Carrie Miller. Welcome to a special Talking Volumes series. As we endure the pandemic together, we are still digital. I'm still missing the Fitzgerald Theater, but we have a terrific group of writers, and I'm glad you're with us. The ideals of justice, integrity, equity animate the work Reginald Dwayne Betts does as both a poet and a lawyer. I was eager to talk to Mr. Betts as the Derek Chauvin trial begins and our community embarks on what will be undoubtedly a traumatic spring. We'll confront truths about ourselves, our relationships as citizens, our reckoning with race and power and authority. And we'll have to be awake to what we see and what we learn. Reginald Dwayne Betts is the author of, among several books, Felon, Poems, and a memoir titled A Question of Freedom, a memoir of learning, survival, and coming of age in prison. Welcome. It's good to have you with us. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, no, it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
I think some of us in this community where George Floyd was killed by Officer Derek Chauvin believe that we learned something about one another. We believe that some of us already knew this. Some of us are learning it for the first time. And now the learning is over, and we're happy it's over because it was difficult. And I know you've thought a lot about learning. It's one of the words in your memoir subtitle. And I want you, if you will, to talk to us about staying in the learning, even when that is really hard, as I think we're going to realize anew in the next coming months.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because having been to prison for a crime that I committed, it forces me always to think about how uncomfortable learning is. And it forces me to realize that my biggest problem with the system was how easy it felt like it was for the prosecutor and for the judge to just conclude who I was, as if their learning about me had an obvious end stop. And so, you know, when I think about the learning being a very long and arduous process, I recognize that's important just because we don't want to come to a superficial understanding. I did a workshop the other day and I asked people to tell me what was the public memories that they have that they remember deeply and intently from their childhood. And these students were younger than me, so they would say 9/11, or they would say the Boston Marathon bombing. One student said the DC sniper case, which I remembered. But I remember the Rodney King trial. Like, that is the incident from my childhood. And so imagine if I thought the trial was going to be the end of the learning.
Yeah,
I would be completely devastated. And I think, you know, going through that trial as a kid and watching the public's response to that trial and Amadou Diallo, you know, Sean Bell, and the names, they become a chant, but they become a chant that reminds us that the learning isn't over. and that the learning is always going to be far more complicated and difficult than a verdict. We already know verdicts are not the voice of God making things okay. Verdicts are just another group of fallible human beings trying to get it right, maybe trying to get it right.
I've been thinking about how the learning will, again, I think, force us as a community and as a nation. There'll be national coverage of this trial. We'll be reminded of what happened, as we should be. But what happens when that kind of learning bumps up against a really closely held sense of identity about who we are in a community like this? And it will tell us some things again that are going to be very hard to accept. And I also think there's kind of a weariness to this. We went through this and it was hard for, in the spring. And now, the pandemic, and we've turned to new things. And now we're going to be back into those most difficult experiences and reminders of who we are as a community and who we are as a nation. So I think about that friction that happens. What comes to mind?
Yeah, but I don't know if these things ever tell us who we are.
Really?
You see, because I carjacked somebody. And so there's another narrative that says who I am is the person that carjacked somebody. I think the real question is, what do we believe is permissible to do to other people?
Mm-hmm.
So that's it, because we could draw lines about just what is not permissible. And once you draw a line and you say this thing is not permissible, then we could wrangle over what happens when people cross that line. But I think the thing that we haven't done as a community is just made a decision. It is impermissible to choke somebody out because they're selling cigarettes. It is impermissible to choke somebody out because they are disobeying a lawful order. Just say, like, what is absolutely impermissible conduct by the police? What is absolutely impermissible conduct by the state? I think that we just aren't willing to say that. I mean, you listen to Richard Pryor, and Richard Pryor is talking about these issues in the 70s. And it's a reason why he's using humor to talk about it. I mean, literally, he's talking about a chokehold. He's like, the police in LA got a chokehold? Yeah, they just choke you to death. You get the cops, they got their arms around you, they choking you. They say, nah, stop, Bill. He's dead. I killed another one. And it is a joke. But he doesn't think it's funny. But what he's trying to do is use the humor to make you see something that you have long ignored. And again, it's the same question today that it was when he was saying it in these comic skits, right? And these live performances during his show. He was saying, what is it permissible to do to another human being? Mm-hmm. And I think that has very little to do with who we are, because the things that we do to people aren't the sum total of who we are. It's a part of it. It might be a huge part of it. But I think that, I just think that we get off track when we keep trying to say that this person is this thing that's happened.
Understood.
Instead of saying,
but
this is us.
But isn't the way we answer that question, what is permissible, with all the caveats and all the rationalizations that come to that answer, indicative of kind of who we are together in a community, how we answer that question of what's permissible?
But I just think we haven't answered it. See, like the chokehold is off the books and has been off the books for a long time in New York, and
mm-hmm.
they still use it. I think that it's just like, if we say that it's impermissible, then when people do it, it's a cut and dry case, and we don't start to try to find rationalizations for the conduct. When we start trying to find rationalizations for the conduct, it just means that we're unwilling in some fundamental way, right, to say that this is impermissible. And look, in 1985, it was a case, Garner v. Tennessee. I think it was Garner v. Tennessee. At the time, most police forces in the United States, right, it was on the books. If a suspect is fleeing, you could use deadly force to stop him. So Garner is some kid that had broken in somebody's house. He's running out the back door. He's climbing and scaling the fence. The cops shoot him in the back of the head. This is 1985. It is permissible under the law to shoot him in the back of the head for fleeing from the scene of a crime. It does not require him to pose a clear and present danger and threat to the community. The case makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court. I was 5 years old in 1985. So when I was 5, that meant that it was legal for the police to shoot me when I was running in the back. It means that we had decided that that was permissible. And it had to go to the Supreme Court to make the determination that no, it wasn't permissible. And this wasn't permissible in every state, but it was permissible in a lot of states, enough so that the Supreme Court had to rule it unconstitutional. And so what I mean is that when you see something happening again and again and again, maybe it means that we haven't really decided as a community, as a city, as a state, as a country, to truly say that this is not permissible. It feels like we had these cases and we had these tragic deaths, these killings, always over something that you could let a person go for.
Right.
When I got arrested, the police had 30 guns on me, 30, and they didn't fire a single one of them. Nobody was confused about what was going on. They thought I might be armed and dangerous, and I thought they might think I was armed and dangerous, and my hand shot right up in the air. And I went to prison. And I was afraid that I might get shot, but the odds were against me being shot. I got a friend who was with me that day. He had his arms up too. He didn't get shot. Years later, he was trying to have a conversation with a police officer. It was a little altercation that happened with an off-duty cop who didn't have a badge out, and it looked like the officer was accosting a woman. So my friend tried to intervene, and he grabbed the officer, not understanding that he was a police officer because he didn't identify himself and he was working security. So it just looked like a man accosting a woman. More police officers came, and it became clear that this guy was a cop. And so, and it was frantic, and officers were like pulling out guns and yelling, and they started yelling at my friend's niece. And he went to talk, and the officer pulled out what looked like a gun. So my friend turned to run. The officer shot him in the back of the head with a stun gun. He fell. He had, bleeding in his brain, but he was fine. He ended up being fine. But the point was, this was a situation where nobody was going to jail for. Mm-hmm. Nobody. Officers believed it was permissible. Instead of just them walking away, instead of just them taking the L, Instead of them sitting down on a curve and letting things calm down for 10 minutes and deciding what to do next, it felt like it was permissible to escalate something to get the conclusion and the outcome that you felt was just, even if you knew the conclusion and the outcome that you were chasing was a citation at best.
Right.
And I think that's what I want us to have is two conversations. One is about accountability, but the other one is about why do we think that this is permissible? I mean, imagine Mr. Floyd shouldn't even been incarcerated, even if he had got picked up for whatever they said he did in the middle of a pandemic. Like a cop should be thinking, I just don't think this is one that we should lay our hat on. Let me give you the $20. You said he passed the fake $20 bill. Here's $20. Let's move on. I mean, I just think that we're afraid to truly ask ourselves, what should a society deem as permissible for authorities to do? And it only becomes frightening in the cases of no consequence, because those cases when people should walk away and they don't lead to the tragedies.
Do you think in some ways we're also asking very publicly who matters?
Yeah, I think every time when you say what is, think about it. When there was no such thing as intimate partner rape, it just meant that it was permissible for a husband to do anything to his wife because she didn't matter at all. Mm-hmm. When people were being held in bondage, It was permissible to do anything to them because they didn't matter at all. And so, I feel like I guess I have become exhausted with the question of, like, did Floyd deserve X? Did Mr. Floyd deserve X? Did this group of prisoners deserve this sentence? Like, I want us to say, what are we willing to say that is permissible for us to do to other people? Because that's when you hold up the mirror to yourself. You ask this officer, is it permissible for somebody to choke your nephew or your cousin until they're nearly exhausted and they expire? Is that permissible? And nobody's going to say that's permissible. They won't. And the thing is, it's not when I got arrested for carjacking, the officers did not believe it was necessary or permissible for them to shoot me, for them to strangle me, and because I understood that, like, I committed a crime, they knew how I would respond. But you got these petty crimes where it's a real question. Should you accost somebody over 25 cents? I mean, that's a legitimate question. That is not a cut and dry issue. And for a long time, I think that gray area is where officers take advantage. That gray area is where we haven't figured out as a society what we want to say, let that one go. I mean, my first client, he was just walking through an open air drug market. He wasn't bothering anybody. And cops accosted him, searched him. They found, like, residue on him. And he was threatened with 5 years in prison. And my question is not what did he deserve, but should it be okay for the police to do that? He got arrested 3 days later when he got on bond. He was asleep on a bench because he was homeless. He didn't have any drugs on him, so they let him go. And so the question becomes, should it be okay for them to harass him in that way when you know he's not going to jail for it unless you get lucky and find some drugs on him? I think that's the harder question to answer.
Do you think this question of who matters also drives a lot of the soul searching we should do about our criminal justice system and how unjust so much of what we've been okay with has been?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to admit how unjust what we think is. Like, we've been okay with a lot, and even now that mass incarceration, the word is in popular rhetoric, I think it allows a lot of us, not to confront things that we were okay with in the past. And sometimes being okay is just passive, assent. It's just, not
just
talking
acceptance.
about it.
Yeah.
And I think that it's, yeah, I got friends who've done 20, 25 years in prison for crimes in which nobody was hurt. And the judge, the prosecutor, everybody involved never just said, is it okay for me to treat this person this way? Like, not do they deserve to be punished? Not like, is the punishment just? I mean, I went to prisons where they had to advise me to be careful. Like, is it okay to send somebody into an environment where you have to give them advice about being careful so that they can stay safe? And we don't ask that question. I was doing some research. I got this 1 million book project, and I'm trying to see what the inside of prisons. Yeah, and I can't wait to talk about it. But, like, this is the crazy. So I'm doing this research. I'm trying to see what the inside of this prison that I served time in looks like, so I can send it to the architect that's doing some work on the project. And so I Google the prison, and the first thing that comes up is prisoner kills other prisoner. And I thought about two things. One, I have a client that's currently at that prison. So when President Biden and Vice President Harris were accepting the presidency and the vice presidency, Biden had just finished his speech. Harris had just started talking, and I got a phone call. And the phone call was from an 804 number, and I knew exactly who it was calling because that's the prison number. So I answered. Client is talking to me, and we're trying to talk about his parole case. And then he says, "Oh, Shy, man, they stabbing him. Oh, man, they stabbing him. Ain't nobody doing that. Man, I got to get out of here, man. They just stabbing him." And you can hear the chaos in the background. And I'm on the phone, And I'm listening to the first Black woman who's the vice president talk about change in this country. And I'm listening to this man describe another man being stabbed in a housing unit that I once served time in. And I realized that what I won't talk about and nobody will talk about when we're trying to argue for his release from prison is that it should not be okay for us to put a person in an environment with conditions that encourage that kind of violence. I saw that clip about the man being killed in the same prison where I did time at by his cell partner. And I remember my client calling me, describing somebody getting stabbed. And I remember when I was at that same prison and another person got murdered by their cell partner. We have conversations about mass incarceration now, but I still kind of just feel like when you say who matters, part of figuring out who matters is like really being honest about what we permit. Mm-hmm. And I think that is like central to the question. We have a tremendous reckoning that needs to happen. And we often say the reckoning is on the part of those who've committed crimes. You know, we say, how do you feel remorse? Have you been rehabilitated? And I think all those are important questions. But another really important question is, how should I feel about myself as a prosecutor, as a judge, as a citizen, for like being alive during a time period where a system exists where people get stabbed with like rusty pieces of metal over pennies, where like riots occur because the response to a pandemic is and some prisons have been great. They figured it out. I mean, prison can't be great. It's an oxymoron. But some prisons have been much better than others, right? They figured out how to try to keep people safe during a pandemic. I have friends who've taken the vaccine, right? They figured out how to maneuver, like how to keep people separated as much as possible and allow people to get space. Other prisons, because they weren't built to imagine treating people humanely, are like, yeah, you get 40 minutes out of your cell every 3 or 4 days. And it is just brutal conditions. And nobody is saying, do we have a right to treat people this way? And I think if we ask that question, then we would do something different.
I listened as you said, you know, the person who is before the judge for sentencing is asked, do you feel remorse for your crime? I think about the veneer of morality that we lay over the criminal justice system with, I think, again, the recognition from a lot of us that there is nothing ultimately very moral about the way criminal justice works in this country. And yet, a lot of us don't know what to do about that. Should we give up on the idea that we are dispensing some kind of justice that's being guided by a moral compass?
No, I don't think so. I think people inside because when I talked to my homeboys, you were preparing somebody for a parole case, and you talk to somebody who's really hurt somebody and who cares about the hurt that they've caused. I mean, they are deeply remorseful, and they spent a long time grappling with those questions. Especially the more violent cases, you know, like you kill somebody, you maim somebody, you rob somebody. I mean, you think deeply about what it meant to cause that kind of pain. And so you do want to be driven by a moral compass. I think that where it's like absent and profoundly lacking is one, you shouldn't get arrested for like a fake $20 bill. You know, that's like low hanging fruit. So when I think about it as being morally bankrupt, the parts of it that are obviously morally bankrupt is the way in which we have built the system that actually prosecutes all of this low hanging fruit that shouldn't exist. It's a professor at Yale, Issa Kola-Houseman, wrote a book called Misdemeanor Land. And in the book, she's accounting for the fact that in these jails in New York, most of the people that cycle through the system in and out are cycling for misdemeanors and low-level offenses. And the question is, this shouldn't even be happening. This is not the prison population. This is the jail population. This is the idea that arrests have ratcheted up. Arrests for things like selling cigarettes. Arrests for things like allegedly having counterfeit money. And I think that that's where that shows us being morally bankrupt. I don't think it shows us being morally bankrupt that attempting to and failing to account for serious violence. I think that we have to. I mean, I think that you have to try to account for burglary. You have to try to account for car theft. But I think the moral bankrupt, the fact that where I would question us as a society is one, how we just don't think thoughtfully or very much at all about the conditions of confinement.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they haven't radically changed, ever. I was at that prison like 15 years ago. How is it still as dark, and how is it more violent? Like how is it more dangerous at this place than it was when I was there? Is this like prisoner inverse of progress? And so this is the thing that I find devastating that we should ask questions about. But I don't want to act as if
No,
I think it's very important to be more.
No,
some
I
people
wasn't
say
saying,
that though.
Yes, I know. I wasn't saying that there isn't incidental morality. And I wasn't saying that the whole system is bankrupt. I was saying that I think we have this illusion that we're guided by some kind of moral. I mean, we Americans I've never spent time in prison. I'm concerned about what happens in prisons, but to the level that I can be. And it gives me some measure of comfort, I guess, to think that there's some kind of moral principle that's guiding the way the criminal justice system works once people get into it. Maybe
Right.
that's just an illusion.
I agree. No, but that's why I brought up the question of like the misdemeanor land.
Getting into,
because you see, you see it's an illusion when you think about like what is happening is the prosecutors and ratchet it up. And so you see that it's an illusion when you really think about not my case and not the rape and not the robbery. I mean, we still may say that the way that we deal with these cases is hugely problematic. Mm-hmm. And we still have to say that the systems that exist, the overcrowding, the dangerousness, is a huge issue. But just on some fundamental level, who we allow to get into the system, that is a huge problem. And I think we allow it to happen maybe because we think it's morally principled. But if we really viewed it, I mean, I had a client once, right? She had a dog and she was living in a slum. And DCF, she had 2 kids, right? DCF was like, you can't live here because your door doesn't lock. And so they gave her money to move to a new apartment. It's a snowstorm outside right now. And she moved during a snowstorm and her car broke down. She had left her dog there. She was like, I'm going to come back later on the day to pick the dog up because I had all this stuff or whatever. The dog dies. There's a snowstorm. Her car broke down. She couldn't get back to the house for the dog. They prosecuted her for cruelty to animals. And I remember in Connecticut, they got this weird thing where like when you're a defense attorney, you negotiate like the deals and the outcomes of cases, and you in a room with other defense attorneys and other prosecutors. So I'm in this room and I'm hearing the cases being negotiated. And there's this woman that stole like $70,000 from somebody she worked for. And the judge was like, well, I'll give her 7 years suspended. And the defense attorney took it. And the prosecutor said, well, we want restitution. And the judge said, she doesn't have any money. I'm not going to make her pay money that she doesn't have back. That's just going to hang it over her head and get her locked back up again. If you want money, take it to civil court. Prosecutors are mad, but I was like, that's legit,
Yeah.
She doesn't have money. I was like, this judge seems righteous. Other case, though, was a case, some guy touched some little boy in a swimming pool. And I was like, I don't know if that's okay. And he got like a program. And I was like, oh, that's rough. I don't know what I think about that. But okay, it means that the judge is trying to find a way to deal with these things outside of incarceration. I'm feeling good. I'm like, my client accidentally killed a dog. It is no way, straight. Another case settled without prison. Come to my case. And the prosecutor says, I'm going to offer 5 years, suspended after 3.
So she was going to go to prison?
I'm doing a math in my head. I think they said suspended after like 3.5, because if you do 18 months, you could do it at the jail, right? So I'm doing the math in my head and I'm like, that can't be right. Just 18. No, this is crazy. And I'm like, this is absurd. And the judge was like, yeah, I think that's too much. 5 years suspended after 5 years suspended 4.
Mm-hmm.
So he offered her a year. And I thought, no, my client is not going to accept a year in jail for accidentally killing a dog. And she has 2 children in diapers. What is this about? This has to be absurd. This woman had to go through this process for like 18 months before it got resolved. And it was hard. I mean, I would just watch her having to bring her children to court. Look, man, I love animals. I love dogs. I don't love all animals, but I love dogs, right? I don't think it's bad that the dog died, but really, this it wasn't on purpose. And it was a year, and like, how can you? That's when I think it's morally bankrupt. That these men sat in this courtroom and talked as if a year in jail was an adequate or appropriate punishment for a woman with 2 young children who accidentally killed a dog. I think that that's what's morally bankrupt. And it's a way in which our system is so complex and so and so hidden from the view of the public that it's like hard to understand the absurdity of some of these decisions. Just like, you face for a fake $20 bill, you facing 5 years in jail. It's like even hard to be confronted with the absurdity of the decision. And that's why I think, I don't know, I try to point out misdemeanor land because I try to say where we see where we fail is when we look closely at what happens to people who don't end up in jail, who don't end up in prison, but still end up with misdemeanor convictions because they had to take a plea, still end up with felony convictions because they had to take a plea. I mean, these are cases where people don't believe that folks should be in prison, and yet they still believe that they should have this anchor attached to their lives and have to go through that process.
I think what you just said about it's hidden from view, from public view, some of that seems to be changing, right? Some of these movements in, I think, like the city of Chicago and others, to stop demanding ridiculous bails. And if people can't make the bail, they spend, oh my God, months and years in jail awaiting their case to be tackled. What are some of the other ways to bring this more into public view?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm a writer. So I think the main way to bring it into public view is to find ways to really tell the stories about what's going on. I do think, I think about, I just take it back. I mean, I think about Roots and what Roots did for the country's understanding of the antebellum period.
The television show. The
television show, right. I think about how that really brought things to people's mind that they just didn't fully understand at all.
Right.
And I just think it hasn't been, or take The Jungle, Upton Sinclair, that really says something about the meat packing industry and how profoundly unjust so much of what was going on there was. Grapes of Wrath. We don't have that really talks about the fundamental ways that prison touches people and destroys them. And I think that's probably what we need. We have some things, we have like Shawshank Redemption, but that's not about the system. That's about a prison and how dangerous prisons are. We have American Me, Blood In, Blood Out, but these things, and those are important too, but they don't do this other thing that we need right now. I mean, you think about a book like A Lesson Before Dying, which is the first book I read cover to cover. It's a beautiful book, but notice it's written in the 80s, right? Comes out, you got this kid who's a juvenile who was convicted of capital murder. Now he's innocent, but he's convicted of capital murder and he gets the death penalty as a juvenile. The whole book is premised on him not going to the electric chair as a pig, because that's what the prosecutor says during a trial. This is not a boy, this is a pig. That's what the prosecutor says. What's amazing is that the book is a real reflection of his time period. So when you read it, you have to understand that there was a time period where a prosecutor would call a child a pig to justify killing him. And that was, like nobody reviewed that book and said, I don't think this matches with how we treat people in the justice system. Nobody said this book is not good because it's fundamentally false. It's based on the premise that we would execute somebody who's innocent. People read the book and was like, yeah, we do that sometimes. Now you fast forward 2020. And in 2005, the Supreme Court said that it's unconstitutional to execute somebody for a crime committed as a juvenile. So already this kid couldn't get executed in 2020, even if he had been guilty, right? So the book has to be premised in a different way. You look at the innocence projects that have popped up in every state in this country. So already, if you're writing this book, when you do research, you're like, wait a minute. Oh, nah, maybe I should be talking about this. Maybe I should talk to these lawyers. You have all of these innocence projects. How does this work? You have governors pardoning people who are innocent on the back end. How does this work? And you have a whole movement that's fighting the death penalty that's far more robust now than it was when that book was written. What I'm trying to say is that book was trying to tackle the times of it, the moment that it was written in. Where is the book that's tackling this moment? That will be a narrative that is just as powerful, that is looking at Moneybell. You know, looking at, it's a case that the Civil Rights Corps worked on, and I turned it into a poem. And one of the lines was, he owed $1,000 for a traffic ticket, and that's what they locked him up for. And the thing that was like brutal when I read it was he lost his job while sitting in jail. So he only owed $1,000. He was taking care of his children. And he had to sit in jail because he couldn't pay the $1,000 fine. And then he loses his job while sitting in jail. If that is not the most inefficient of outcomes, then I just must be crazy, you know? And we need, and that, I mean, then if you animate it, that is like Shakespearean tragedy, you know, it's like an absurdity, right? It's like, it was in one of the cases, the woman has, when the lawyers go see her, she has written on the back of a piece of paper, she's trying to keep track of how long she has to work to pay off her debt, because they say she could pay off her debt $50 per day. And like each day that she's locked up, it takes $25 off her debt or something like that. And so she has these tick marks on the back of a piece of paper because she's trying to do the math to figure out how many days she will have to work to get back to her children. I mean, this has to be like Shakespearean drama, but it's not, you know, and I think that's one of the things. And this is probably like a simple solution. And somebody would say, you need a policy answer. You need to point to a governor doing this or doing that. But I think that art has always been really important in making a mass of people understand a problem in a way that cuts through some of the ways in which we set ourselves up as ideologues. And so I really fundamentally believe that we need this problem animated by art in a more public and profound and moving way.
What do you think the poetry of Etheridge Knight in its time, right? He was writing in the 60s. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think it was saying?
In the 60s and 70s. You know what? I was going to read one poem, but now I'm going to read a different one.
Okay.
And I'm going to read it because I could tell a story about it. And so I'll read it first and then I'll tell a story. Okay. And I should say for the audience, it's a hard poem. And it talks about sexual violence. For freckle-faced Gerald. I'm just going to read the last 4 stanzas. Take Gerald. 16 years hadn't even done a good job on his voice. He didn't even know how to talk tough or how to hide the glow of life before he was thrown in his pig meat for the buzzards to eat. Gerald, who had no memory or hope of copper hot lips or firm up-thrusting thighs to reinforce his flow, let tall walls and buzzards change the course of his river from south to north. No safety in numbers like back on the block. 2's aplenty. 3, definitely not. 4, you're all Muslims. 5, you were planning a race riot. Plus, Gerald could never quite win with his precise speech and innocent grin, the trust and fists of the young black cats. Gerald, sun-kissed 10,000 times on the nose and cheeks, didn't stand a chance, didn't even know that the loss of his boss had been plotted years in advance by wiser and bigger buzzards than those who now hover above his track and at night light upon his back. So I'm 16, 17. I'm in solitary confinement. And somebody slides this book. I told this story 100 times and I'll tell it 1,000 more. Somebody slides the Black Poets under my cell door. And I'm reading the book. And I stop on this cat named Etheridge just because I'm like, I don't know nobody named Etheridge. Let me see what he's talking about. And he like has 47 pictures taped on my cell wall. I'm reading his work. I read this poem for Freckle-Faced Gerald. In fact, that one was in every shed I ain't sleep. But I read for Freckle-Faced Gerald, and I think, damn, I didn't know a poem could do that. I didn't understand that a poem could say something about history. I was 16 years old in prison, and I thought that my cohort of youngins were the first group of people sent to prison as children. I thought like my fears were new. And I read that poem and understood that a poem could tell you something about the world that matters and about the world that threatens. And the question is just who was listening? 16 years hadn't done a good job on his voice. I couldn't believe, I really couldn't, that we had been sending children to prison for that long. And again, if you think about the poem says not what did Gerald deserve. It doesn't tell you what he was convicted of.
Mm-hmm.
It asks what is permissible for us to do to somebody else. As violent and dangerous as prisons are, for most of this country's history, we thought it was okay to send juveniles to prison with adults. I'm going to talk about as far back as the 1890s. The earliest case you'll find is the 1890s. Black boy gets sentenced to die because got in a fight and killed a white kid. Goes to the Supreme Court 3 different times. First time he wins, second time he loses, third time he loses again, and then they execute him. He was a juvenile. I mean, we've been reckoning with this question for the entire history of this country. And that poem is what first revealed it to me. You know, and after I read that, I one, decided to be a poet, but two, I decided to stop pitying myself so damn much, you know. I was like, I need to survive, and two, I need to act like life is about more than just me. And I think that's what good poetry does. And that's what, like, hearing the stories of others, I mean, it moves you to action in a way. And I was mostly powerless in prison, but at least I was grateful. I mean, I was always good at talking trash. And I mean, you know, I could win the trust of people's fists, and people loved me. And it made me feel like really thankful for the things I had given the circumstances, right? And then when I came home, it made me feel like I had a responsibility to recognize how everybody aren't blessed with those same gifts. And so how do you tell the stories to make people maybe move in a way reading that poem made me move?
What was the poem you originally were going to read?
I was going to read this poem. It's called The Idea of Ancestry. And you know, it was interesting because that poem, I still love that poem. It's about the first line is taped to the wall of my cell are 47 pictures, 47 faces. My father, mother, grandmothers, one dead, grandfathers, both dead, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, cousins, first and second, nieces and nephews. They stare across the space at me sprawling on my bunk. I know their dark eyes. They know mine. I know their style. They know mine. I am all of them. They are all of me. They are farmers. I am a thief. I am me. They are thee. And in that poem, you know, I thought what was important about it is when we talk about reform and we talk about prison and what should happen, and sometimes we had that conversation without that moral reckoning, right? Mm-hmm. And I just believe it should go both ways. And I just wanted to say, like when I was talking earlier, I was just trying to double down on this fact that men inside, women inside, children inside, to a larger degree than the public is willing, I think, to recognize is they're reckoning with what it means. You know, when he's saying, I am a farmer, they are a thief. He is drawing a line in the sand. It's like, I get it. I get it. I get it. And it's hard. And sometimes you fail, you know, and I think that when we recognize that folks do that consistently and are willing to do that, I think it should make us even more staunchly ask, what does it mean to put people in conditions and situations that just aren't conducive to that kind of retrospect?
Right.
I literally never had a therapist in prison. I mean, I had one guy talk to me. He was like, you know, I just had to talk to you because you were at a super maximum security prison and now you moved down to a lower level and we need to do a psych evaluation. And I was like, now? He was like, what do you mean now? I was like, well, I mean, I've been in a hole for 15 months. I've been in prisons in the mountains where I was locked up 23 hours a day. I'm just trying to figure out, why would you talk to me now? He was like, well, I just need to know, have you ever considered suicide? I was like, did you listen to what I just said? Like I just described the absolute conditions for suicidal ideation. Like, this is like when you look up the definition, it says put somebody in the cell for 23 hours a day. And he said I was arrogant. He said I was arrogant and I was belligerent, and I obviously didn't need his help to get out of his office. I was like, whatever.
I didn't realize
Like,
that you actually spent part of your sentence in a supermax prison.
yeah.
Oh my God. Why?
All kinds of stupid reasons. My charge was carjacking, and back then, youth was a aggravating factor, not a mitigating factor.
Oh.
And so the younger you got locked up, you got extra points on your security profile. You were like more dangerous. I was 125 pounds, but I was more dangerous. And so it was that. It was my charge. Carjacking is a really violent charge. I had a gun, so it was that. But the main thing is I caught a assault charge on an officer. I wouldn't let a guard close my door. So I just held it up like this and wouldn't let her close my door. And they said I assaulted her for it by not letting her close my door. And so that gave me a bunch of extra points. And then the Supermax had just opened up and they just needed bodies there. And so, a bunch of us just got shipped there. The Human Rights Watch used to say what people can do. I mean, they protested. And they weren't protesting my case specifically, but Red Onion State Prison, they had shotguns and they were shooting people. People were losing their eyes. There was a lot of violence. And they protested the Human Rights Watch, and they did a report. And they were arguing there was a lot of people there who were supposed to be the worst of the worst, whatever that means. And it was like people didn't qualify for it at all. And so I ended up getting moved. Actually, I got sent there, and then like 2 months later, I got moved. And I was so happy. I mean, I was so happy to get, man, I was so happy to get out of there. They didn't even have curtains on the showers. I mean, they had the stalls, but it was just not a good place. I was happy to get out.
Did
it's all.
Did your mother come to see you when you were at the Supermax?
Nah, not 17 hours away.
Is that how far it was? Wow.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, she wasn't coming up there. It was like I was a different person by the time she saw me. I mean, I had like my hair had grown and like my shoulders, I had locks. Because she came to see me at the next prison. I did 6 months in the hole and got sent to Red Onion, and then got let out in population. And I did like 2 months there. And then I got sent to another. Really, it was a Supermax, but they called it a level 5 instead of a level 6. And then I got in a little bit of trouble there. Same thing, incidental contact with an officer. And I got another 6 months in the hole. And so at this point, I hadn't seen my mom for like 14 months. And so while I was in the hole, she just was like, I'm coming to see you. And her and my grandmother came to see me, and they saw me through the glass. It was I hadn't thought about that in a while. It was a lot.
What was it like the first time your mother saw you in prison?
Oh, well, she had seen me a lot before then. So, I mean, I don't know. I think people are like, they adapt, sometimes. And I will say the reason why I don't know is because prison is this strange game where when you get sent there, the prisoner is trying to hide everything that they're going through. Even if what they're going through is just psychological, even if what they're going through is just what they see, even if what they're going through is just like you're just bitten, you playing spades, whatever, and it ain't even that bad, right? But you hide what you're going through from the people you love because you feel it's your fault that you're there anyway. So the least you could do is just like stand up. And then I think your family, my mom went through a whole bunch of things while I was incarcerated. And so I think your family, they do the same thing. They learn to wear a mask. It's like we wear the mask that grins and lies. Paul Lawrence Dunbar. It's like that's what we learn to do. And so I don't even have an accurate account of it, but I know it was horrific. And this is why I always say, what do we think is permissible to do? Because I know it's horrific, because now that I'm on the outside of it, it like troubles me so much to just think about it, and it's like, I think about my friends that's inside, and it troubles me so much to think about how I did 8 and now I've been out for 16, which means that cohort of men I went to prison with when we were all teenagers, the ones who I'm tight with, who's still there, It means that they've been there for 24, 25 years. And I can't even grapple in my own head with what the last 15, 16 years of their life looked like. And the thing that I just find so profoundly unsettling, right, is if we say, oh, we having a moment of reckoning, I don't even believe that we actually are having a moment in which we could really talk about them publicly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I believe that it is, I just believe we haven't gotten there yet. And I'm just talking about one state, you know, but it's happening in every state. And all of these states are like profoundly different, have different levels of violence, have different levels of programming, have different levels of opportunity, but have similar levels of desperation and pain and sadness. And again, like I just, you know, like this is all done in our name. You know, it's not like the boogeyman under the stairs. I think it feels better when we can say it's the boogeyman under the stairs, but it's sort of like, I know the prosecutor that was trying to send this woman to jail for a year. Like, I know him. I remember he missed the court date because he had to get a stent put in his chest because he was having heart issues. And I was like, damn, I wish you had the same amount of care for her that the doctor's having for you. You know, but I remember I almost got fired over that case. I was just like, I think I cursed in chambers. I was like, I can't believe this. I was like, are you serious? And that's when I realized I couldn't do the job. I was like, I can't be around people who are going to sit here and argue with me about the fact that this woman should do a year in prison because she accidentally killed a dog. I mean, make her work in an animal shelter for a year. I don't care. Like, make her like, I don't know, train Lassie, you know, but you don't put somebody in a cage with children for this. Oh man, I should stop thinking about it. Oh, it's so funny though, right? She was looking for a job. She just had a pending case. She had no previous criminal convictions. Although Target had just filed a suit that said that they couldn't deny people employment, they had just lost a class action lawsuit that said that they had been denying people employment just because they had criminal charges pending, and that they couldn't do that. So they lost the lawsuit or they settled it. She applied for a job at Target and they sent her a letter and said, we can't give you the charge because of this. And this was a pending charge that no guilt or innocence had been concluded. And it was just like, you can't have a job because of this. And this is a company that had just lost a class action lawsuit for doing the same thing. And I was like, yo, you think you should try to find your lawyer and file a lawsuit? It's like, I'm just trying to take care of my kids. I don't got time to file a lawsuit, you know? So we should tell those stories. I think if we told those stories, I think it'll just animate things so much more clearly for people to just get how perverse what we do to people is.
I really have to say, I don't want to miss the story of what you said about the experience of holding back and hiding what it was like to be in prison from your family, and then learning on the other side of prison that your mother and family had to do the same. I mean, you want to talk about Shakespearean tragedy. That is tragic. Because the assumption is, if I really show what this is like, they won't be able to bear it. I mean, your mother might have thought that. I know she was the victim of a crime while you were in prison. And she made a decision not to tell you because she didn't think you'd be able to bear that, right? And you were doing the same.
Yeah, although I hadn't suffered it nearly as much as she had, you know, like I was good. And not like prison wasn't fun. You know, I mean, I didn't have a good time, but all things considered, you know, I was okay. It was just hard, and it was sketchy sometimes, and I would never do it again. I think maybe my biggest asset was I was young enough to be a damn fool, you know, and to be able to adapt to absurdity, you know. But nah, when my mom told me that when my mom told me that that she had been sexually assaulted at it was like the day I came home, and we didn't talk about it again for a decade.
Wow.
You know, and
why?
We talked about it. You carry just the things we carry, you know? I mean, how do you talk about that with somebody? And if I couldn't talk about it to her, you know, I couldn't talk about it to anybody else. Um, and but it was wild though, because like, so somebody was like, "Hey, Dwayne, I heard you in this podcast. I think it'd be great to have you. You know, I heard you talking about your mom. It was beautiful. I think it'd be great to have you and your mom on a podcast doing an interview together." I was like, "My mom is not interested in this. She does not know what a podcast is. I am certain that she's going to say no, but I'm gonna ask her." So I asked her. She's like, "Yeah, it'll be cool. Let's do it." So I was like, and she was like, "Should we prepare?" And I was like, "No, I think we'd be okay." She's like, "What should we talk about?" I was like, "Oh, whatever you want. You know, they probably just gonna ask about prison," and we just smile. And you know, somebody said, "Ask you something that doesn't make sense. Just answer whatever question you want. Just keep it moving." And the lady says, "Can you describe how it was going to court for your son? I understand he was facing a life sentence." And my mom says, "Well, it was really tough because at the same time I was going to court to get the guy who had raped me prosecuted." And I was like, "What?" I was like, I wasn't prepared. I was like, "Are we oh shit." I was like, "All right, I guess this is what we're talking about today." And this is the first time in a decade that and what that taught me though is that like when I think of myself as being really conflicted on these questions of accountability, it is because it wasn't just that my mom couldn't tell me what she was going through. It wasn't just that my family also couldn't tell me. It was that it was no way to articulate this to the public at all. And that even when I came home, the trauma of it all was still in her voice. It almost felt like, when you're young and you go to the swimming pool and you know the water's cold and you just like forget it and you just jump in. Mm-hmm. It's almost like things have been bubbling and bubbling and bubbling. And what hurt me the most was I realized that I had done all of this work that wasn't really accounting for how my work around criminal justice reform set on her ears. Like how was I really negotiating the really, really complicated space of saying that somebody shouldn't die in prison, somebody shouldn't spend 30 years in prison, 40 years in prison, 25 years in prison. And at the same time, some things so profoundly hit us that we just live with it forever. And I think that's like the tension that is so hard to, I don't know, that's why all of us want different jobs. And what happens is the people who have like legislators, they just make vague notions of what justice looks like and draw no hard lines and know that nobody's watching. So when the prosecutor, sentence somebody to 35 years and in the next room, somebody gets 9 for the same thing, it's like, discretion. And that's a problem.
I want to recommend for our viewers and our listeners the essay that you wrote for the New York Times about this.
Yeah, it was
last October.
I forgot what they called it.
Right?
Yes, I came out October. Yeah, came out in October. A few weeks. Came out like 2 weeks before the election. Right. I worked on it for 2 years. I worked on it for a long time, knowing it, and it morphed a lot because the times were shifting. But the greatest thing that happened probably was that Senator Hurst dropped out the presidential race, and then she got picked up as VP because I felt like I was empowered. At least in my own head, because nobody was ever telling me what to write, but I was empowered in my own head and trying to account for what it meant for Senator Hurst to have been a prosecutor. I was able to like think seriously about my mom for the first time. And I do think we had this notion that like politics and political figures is like arrogant. He's like, dude, come on, man. You was writing about the vice president and you made it a piece about your mama and your homeboys in prison. And I was like, I'm like a politician, baby. I stay on message, Like, right. But it really was though, because it made me think that the more often we could collapse the distance between the decisions of policymakers and the lives of people on the ground, I think the better decisions we may get. And in that piece, that's all I was trying to do is like collapse that distance and take seriously both how my mom felt about everything, but also how I feel about dudes in prison who I love, who I deeply feel should have been released long ago. And some of them, they committed murders. And it is a hard thing to grapple with, that we just kick the can on way too often.
I want to ask you to read a poem from Felon, and then we're going to talk about the Million Book Project, which is really, I'm excited to hear about what's the latest on it.
Cool. Yeah, I am excited too. And I'm going to go back to this poem that I was going to read. I'll just read this. November 5th, 1980. I have called in my wasted youth the concrete slabs of prison home, awakened to God's keeping tabs on my breath, bartered with every kind of madness, the state's mandatory minimums, and my own callous. I've never called the man father, and while sleep twice wrecked cars, drank whiskey straight, nothing suffices. I fell in love with sons I wouldn't give my name. Once swam at midnight in the Atlantic's violence. Under the water, rattling, broke the silence. I cussed men with fists like ham bones and got beaten to dust. Buried memories in my gut that would fill a book. I've carried pistols, but I've never held a bullet. There is frightful little left for me to hold in fear. Definitely not the debt that threatens to hollow me. I've abhorred transparency, confessed to so-and-so, but what of it matters? In this life, so much is troubled, and a few things that didn't never failed to baffle.
You're listening to my conversation with poet and lawyer Reginald Dwayne Betts. He's the author of a number of books, including Felon, Poems, and a memoir titled A Question of Freedom, a memoir of learning, survival, and coming of age in prison. Let's talk about the Million Book Project, funded by the Mellon Foundation. And I know you're working with your friend Elizabeth Alexander on this.
Yes.
It isn't only about getting books into prisons. It's also about giving people who are incarcerated experiences with authors. Is that right?
Yeah. So definitely, I think that I will argue that what we believe is freedom begins with a book, and take that seriously. And if you take that seriously, you ask, well, what does that mean? And it means that first you got to be able to touch a book, hold a book, and have books in your presence. I see your bookshelf behind you. I see a bookshelf behind you. It's a cool book on the top of the shelf. And my bookshelf is to the right of me. And my sons have bookshelves. And it struck me one day, I did 8.5 years in prison. You go to the library, but sometimes you got a job that doesn't allow you to go to the library. Sometimes you just shook. You're afraid. You don't want to dealing with the guards, or you don't want to dealing with the other prisoners. And so you just opt out of going to the library and try to stay to yourself. What would it mean if you had, like, my first real job was the pod librarian, and they gave me like 20, 30, 40 books, and I would like figure out what people wanted to read, and I would give it to them. And they would come to me, and it was like a source of like identity to know who likes what. I mean, it was real, and but that was one of the few times when the books were close to us. And even the books being close to us, it was just in a lock in a gray box. What would it mean to put bookshelves in housing units, to create a kind of atmosphere that was more than just the dank, dark, brutal structures of prisons? So that's one aspect, is to just create this freedom library and put it in housing units and like saturate prisons, where each housing unit has these 500 books that spans from like Plato to Faulkner to John Edgar Wideman to Gwendolyn Brooks to Lucille Clifton. And it also has the contemporary books that will never end up in prison because the print runs end up being just 1,000. The National Book Award winners from the last 5 years, none of those books are probably in prisons. The Booker Prize winners, none of them are in prison. The books that become movies, not in prisons. The Blind Side, not in prisons. You could go on and on and on down the list. And so the idea is to bring those books in, but also to bring the authors and the writers in. Already we have maybe 13 that have signed up, and we have dozens that have committed to doing it, that I just said, well, we need to wait to get things in place. And these are writers that's like, I will go into a prison in my community. Because one of the reasons why we can do what we do to men and women and children in prison is because nobody sees it and nobody pays them attention. But I should say, prisons often frequently have high rates of alcoholism and suicide among the guards. There's also like a forgotten population. They struggle as well. One of the jokes we used to tell guards who were messing with us is like, dude, you got life too. You just doing yours 13 hours at a time. You come in here, they take your cell phone, they take your purse. Look at how you dressed. Your uniform barely looks better than mine, and they strip your dignity just like they strip mine. Now, maybe that's not 100% true, but it is true that the prison experience works in both directions. And so we're also putting freedom libraries in the space of the guards, because if we truly believe stories matter, everybody needs to have access to those stories. And when I've gone into prisons, I'm never just talking to the prisoners. I'm talking to everybody, and anybody could ask me a question. I show up there just like I show up at a university. And so we got a cohort of folks that's doing this. One amazing partnership that we have actually is with an organization called Literature to Life. Because one of the things people think is like, I can't read a book. I can't read Richard Wright's Black Boy. I got a fourth grade read. I'm on a fourth grade reading level. I'm like, well, that's not true. I mean, you might have to struggle through it, but you could read it. And so what Literature to Life does is they take a work like Black Boy, and then they turn it into a solo show, all with Richard Wright's words. And so we'll have the actor, this cat Tarantino, who performs Black Boy. We'll have him come into the prison, perform Black Boy, and everybody will get it. People will see the reflection of their lives in that work. And then we'll drop 100 copies of Black Boy in there to give away to folks so that they can take it back to their housing unit and read. And then we'll have a freedom library there. And the idea is to expansively as possible, expose people to the different ways that literature operates. Whether you're talking about poets, whether you talk about fiction writers, whether you talk about memoirists, or whether you talk about actors who perform their pieces and bring this work to life. The idea really is to say that it's a choice always. I mean, I think prison is a brutal place, but I don't want to act like prison is just a brutal place. A man I didn't know heard me ask for a book and slid me to Black poets because he thought it might matter to me. Another cat that I just met gave me this book, Every Shat I Ain't Sleep, because he was like, I think Shaheed would dig this book. He don't know why he thought I would like it. He might have just not liked it himself. But he was like, this young cat seems to like reading. I'm going to give him this thing that I think he might like. And it profoundly changed my life. And so, we spent a lot of time talking about how horrible prison is. And I don't want to act as if it's not. But I think to the extent that people have to live there, it is a duty to find ways to invest in those minds, and to find ways to invest in the notion that what we believe matters out here matters out there. I've been in so many colleges. I've never been in a college that didn't have a reading series. I've never been in a college that didn't bring guest speakers in. I've been in a lot of prisons too. Served time in at least 7. None of them had guest speakers. And I think that's another reason why we neglect those spaces. That's more evidence of how we neglect those spaces. And so trying to work to create a project that is, it's a mission. It says freedom begins with a book, and we can actually make that a reality. I mean, my freedom, I've read law books in prison, and I've represented and got 3 friends out of prison this year. The same dude that I was studying law in the cell when he watched me studying law to just take this paralegal course just because I was trying to find a better way to bid. That same man who I was working with, who had a life sentence, I went to the parole board and represented him and got him out of prison. And so I deeply believe that freedom begins with a book. And I think it's possible to transform how people interact with literature, how people think about literature, and more importantly, to see them and allow them to see us so that we can actually say, yeah, is this permissible? Is this okay? And I think we will say no. And maybe we would demand real and legitimate change, after that.
Dwayne, I really thank you for the time. You are such a busy man with a lot of things to do.
And we've sent in Minnesota's a huge partner. We send in a lot of books to Shakopee, to a few of those other prisons, the Minnesota Prison Writers Project out there. I mean, they doing, great work. And so I've always thought about Daniel Kopperwitz. They're doing he runs the education in the Minnesota DOC.
Yeah.
We need that partners, they're doing great work.
That's good.
So I appreciate it. Yeah.
Good.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rohan Preston at the Star Tribune, and thank you all for visiting with us tonight. And thanks to Carrie Miller and to Reginald Dwayne Betts for that great conversation. We'll have a little bit of a panel now. They're gone for the evening, but we have a special guest here. Oh, by the way, I should introduce myself. I'm Rohan Preston at the Star Tribune. And our special guest is Brother Shane Price. He and his wife co-founded the Power of the People Leadership Institute. And they train and help with personal development. And Brother Shane Price himself leads workshops and other things to help men and women who are coming out of prison to transition. So I want to welcome you, Brother Price, and I want to encourage everyone, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A function, and we'll answer those as well. Welcome, Brother Price.
Thank you, Brother Rohan.
Yeah, that was a tremendous interview. I was so moved. Hearing Reginald Dwayne Betts ask the question, what is permissible? What is permissible in our name? And also speaking about the power of art to cut through ideology and help us see the burdens that are being carried. Really profound. Tell us about your work and about helping young men and women transition back into this life.
Yes, Rohan, thank you. The what is permissible? We're going to have to peel that back a bit because it was very profound. But in my work, actually started. Incidentally, I was invited to a prison in Faribault, Minnesota, to speak to a group of African American men at that time, I went up there. I didn't really intend to develop anything for it, but just to be accountable in my work. And there was a request on the table, and I wanted to be accountable to the request, but after the request came, it came from the education director at that institution at that time. I had a dream about an uncle of mine who was a mental health client at the Faribault facility when the prison was a mental health facility. And in that dream, it said something simple. It said, now, what if your uncle needed help and somebody helped him, and now you're acting as if you're too busy to go up and see what these people are talking about. And so I went up, Rohan, and it was about 35 young men that I met with on the first time, and it was very exhilarating. It was a great experience for me, and I think they enjoyed it. And I went back home and talked to my wife, Dr. Price, as you mentioned earlier, who had written a book called The Power of People, 4 kinds of people who could change your life. And I thought, honey, we just sitting at the kitchen table. She's having her tea and I'm having coffee. And I said, I think I could take the book and develop a curriculum and a training around it and continue to work with these men. And so I connected back with the contact there at the prison, and she was a go with her. And I have been in one of the institutions from that time to this. Had no idea, and I'll stop when I say this, I had no idea that it was going to be my life's work. I thought I was just visiting. However, about 6 or 7 years in, I heard that voice that said, man, have you finally realized that I have sent you here to do my work? And I was like, oh, wow, I guess so. And so we've been diligent about it for the last 15 years. We've trained over 5,000 individuals in 5 of the 8 Minnesota state correctional facilities. And we've developed a reentry, or I say the word reentry so your listeners would understand, a replanting initiative that allows our trained individuals from prison to transition into new ground and replant themselves, start again with a fresh understanding. I would take a page from the young man's topic that freedom begins with the book. Well, for our guys, pop guys, as we're called now, pop guys, the freedom began with the book, The Power of People, 4 kinds of people who can change your life. And incidentally, just this evening here at our office, we hosted one of our meetings where we had, about 13 or 14 young men, all who have come home from prison, all who have been COVID-19 tested many times, and who are helping each other survive and thrive through the vicissitudes of transition.
One of our questions that immediately jumped out is Jessica Nordell asked, what do you see as the conditions that help lead to true rehabilitation for people who've committed violent crimes? What are the things that help with the transition?
Right. It's a great question. And I think for us, what we talk about is being brutally honest with self. Our guys really have to take inventory. Our class is very intrusive. It asks a lot of questions. We ask them nicely, but once you go to answer them, it really puts a demand on you to really go through what was it that really got you to prison? What was that? Now, it not necessarily the crime, Rohan. It could have been a condition that became habitual, and the habit led you to a crime that you would not have committed had the habit not existed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I'm getting that. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about addictions and other things, right?
Well, I mean, even addicted to a street life, a kind of a street culture that supposedly certain things are permissible.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we discover through introspection that these things aren't permissible and they've led you to a place that you don't want to be, and now you've got to go back into yesterday, make peace with whoever that was or whatever the environmental situation was, and then figure out how that is helpful to you in your present state that's incarcerated, and you can begin to live a better life while you're incarcerated once that takes place. And we kind of assist our guys in making that personal transformation inside, so that by the time the parole time does actually come, you've already freed yourself from the bondage of the box that existed before the crime was committed in the first place.
What's interesting, Brother Shane, and thank you for that answer, is Reginald Dwayne Betts' book is called Felon. And I think of that word the way I think of as one of those things that people that gets attached and never leaves. If you are a crab or a shellfish of some sort, you have to shed your skin in order to grow. And that word, and I don't want to get hung up on it, but it seems to hold things in place, and it becomes a metaphor in a way for our prison system, which is called corrections, but how much correcting is done there, you know?
Wow, and the metaphor that you talk about, the notion of prison or as felon, or the word felon becomes a handle. And that handle is associated with the stereotype of the neighborhood that you've come from.
Mm.
And so it takes on a double meaning in some ways. And for some of our young men, they don't really have a buffer between what felonious behavior can lead you to versus what is the opposite, the antithesis of that behavior, and what that can lead you to. It becomes a blurred line, if you will. And so I think the notion of the word felon has been stamped, and I mean rubber stamped into Black and brown communities in a way that demand that we do enough soul searching, as Reginald obviously did, to lift that weight off of you and become the somebody that you were destined to be in the first place. I don't believe, sitting here in Minneapolis, that Reginald Betts didn't always have lawyer potential in him. What I believe is that the environment maybe didn't support it, and therefore it got lost. But somewhere inside, as he indicated, somebody handed him a book and said, "Man, you're worth this." And in prison, a book is like money. It's like barter, right? So they were giving him something of great value, and he took it upon himself to use that value wisely. And look what has been produced now. His idea of 1 million books is a really profound idea.
It's wonderful. Hey, one of our question that's come in from Christine Brown asks, when we talk about what's permissible, we need to be honest that there's one system for white folks and one for Black folks. The system was built on anti-Blackness, and that has not changed. We have to address the moral bankruptcy of the ongoing anti-Blackness and bigotry that continues to affect Black folks in these ways. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, what was the young lady's name? I'm sorry.
It's Christine Brown.
Christine, I just appreciate her question. And to be honest with you, as you read it, I could feel the pain of the truth of the question run across me, because yes, the W.E.B. Du Bois, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, he called that this two-ness. And
double consciousness.
This double consciousness that African Americans, that Blacks have to have in order to kind of survive in a Western culture in a way. And that work that he did so many years ago now, it still rings true today. I'll say this to that question. Somebody gave an order. The idea that it's okay, it's permissible to shoot unarmed African-American men, it hasn't stopped since George Floyd. This has continued. If you check your research, it's continued right along in a steady fashion. My question is to the sister and to the listeners, who gave that order? Where does that order come from? And if there is an operational body that is giving that kind of order to the protect and serve folk, how do we ever get after what's at the bottom of that? How do we retake control of a necessary police force that allows protect and serve to be equitable and doable for everyone? And Rohan, if we can't get to that, then my daughter, my 12-year-old daughter, is still in trouble, and my grandchildren are in trouble. And this is why we do, in some ways, the work that we do, is because we want to alleviate that trouble for our seed and our generations. We want to make it better, but who has given that order that would allow the unpermissible to be permissible? I can't answer that question.
So, and one of the, I'm really still profoundly moved by the conversation that Carrie Miller had with Reginald Dwayne Betts. And one of the questions that sort of animates it, we live in a country with the biggest prison population in the world, right? And which is 4% of the world's population, and a significant number of the world's prisoners. Is prison for reform? for rehabilitation, or is it for punishment? You know?
Right. And I think that begs the question that Reginald asked. He saw, even as a lawyer, Reginald Betts, the lawyer, was realizing that the system was operating in a purely punitive way toward specific individuals. He also experienced it as an ex-offender and an inmate, as prison punishment was meted out by the authorities more harshly or more violently for certain people inside.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's seen it from both sides. It does exist. Who gave that order? I'm going to ask that question again for our listeners. Let me make a suggestion, and the suggestion is, where does hope lie? And I will say to you, in the work that I do, I really needed the election to bring about new leadership. The reason why I say that is because I believe that hope itself was under attack. And that attack, on the level that Reginald Betts had come from out there in, I believe it was Baltimore, about in Maryland. I mean, at that level, hopelessness, it just can't reign supreme. We've got to be able to hold on to hope, or I think we lose the ship. And so I was grateful in a hopeful way that new leadership had come forward, just because I believe that strengthened and fed the dynamic of hope, and that dreams for all of ourselves wasn't going to be completely deferred.
That's another poem, and a beautiful reference to Langston Hughes.
Yes.
Brother Shane, thank you so much. And I really want to thank NPR, Minnesota Public Radio, and the whole team there, and the Star Tribune. This Talking Volume series is really, really important at this moment when
Yes.
the world is on looking at us, and this trial is about to get going, and juror was seated today. All of that is sort of turning. Carrie Miller was asking really just about weariness. And I understand the question. Reginald spoke to it as well, about how the real one of the issues now is not so much weariness, is figuring out how to confront
Right.
what we have, and the pain of learning and growing through where we are now.
Right. And that is a operational bottom line that we have to spring forward from. There are no other options. If I can't get there with my family, the chances are you won't get there with yours. And so wherever there is, as Americans, as Minnesotans, I'm from Minnesota, I'm from Minneapolis, I'm from the North Side, but I want to get there, and I want to get there with you. And I don't want you to have to get there in spite of me. I want you to get there with me, and I want to be able to get there with you. Hope is all we have to hold on to, and it's what keeps us laughing, and it's what keeps us smiling, and it's what keeps us getting up and going to work every day, as you do over at the Tribune. And I just want to acknowledge the work that you do over there. We need you in that role. So keep hope alive over there at the Star.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I thought we were wrapping up. We have more questions coming, actually.
Oh, wow.
So I'll ask our listeners here to continue with us for a few more minutes. Karen Sandberg wants to know, as a white person, could prison systems exist to allow white folks to feel comfortable? How do we undermine this view? And then Robert Brooks asked, is it possible that the WHO made it permissible is the levels of trauma we carry with us to the table, all our fears and our anger? I mean, I imagine you could spend 10 minutes on each of those.
And so just in the interest of time, I'm not 100% clear where we are there with time, but I'll take Robert's question first, if I could, and then the notion of what is permissible. And you know, I grew up here, Robert, in the Twin Cities, and you know, I grew up on the North Side, and I grew up in the time with police brutality. I grew up on Plymouth Avenue and those kind of things in the 60s. And I was out there back in the day, just a young one, but I witnessed a lot of things. And, you know, I grew up with that police versus blacks theology. That was our real theology, even as a young one. It took me many years, Robert, before I got over, or got not, I don't know if it was over, but I made peace with that us against them thing. And I think it came at some point where I took permission and authority in my own life to be a proper living citizen. And when I did that, some of the drama from us versus them, it fell off me. And it allowed me to see more optimistically than I was able to see before. No one, and people offered me chances at this before, but like Reginald in his piece, I was too young to appreciate what a real opportunity was. And so I had to age some, and through maturation, I was able to understand what it means to be a high-functioning citizen in Minneapolis and Minnesota and in the world, and the rights and privileges that go along with that. Now, I say all of that to say, how do I get that message to the other Blacks and Browns who continue to suffer from the me, us against them theology? And that is a part of my work.
That's great.
Carol's do we have a moment for her question?
Yeah, yes.
Can you just repeat it to me?
Oh, absolutely. She wanted to know that is our prison system basically there to allow white citizens to feel comfortable?
Right.
And how do we undermine that?
That's such a great question. Let me just mention to you that the history of prisons in Minnesota goes back to Stillwater. Stillwater is the oldest prison in Minnesota. And at the time that it was built, it's over 100 and some odd years old. At the time that it was built, there were very few Black folks in Minnesota. And so I just want you to understand that prison wasn't built for Black people, but it was built for people with poor behavior and whose value system needed work, right? It wasn't until the African Americans' emancipation from slavery, and people began to move north looking for employment and jobs. It wasn't until that time when and then maybe 50 to 75 years after that, where we had enough numbers to really populate prisons. To be quite honest with you, it wasn't until the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, where we found an exponential amount of African-American men being arrested for all types of what was determined as criminal behavior. So my point there is that historically, prison wasn't built for Blacks. However, as a part of our racial theology, it has become a place that houses Blacks And yes, that is done to support the belief that Europeans are safe from the African American population. I'll just say this, in my work, I don't only work with African Americans, I work with Europeans too. And I can't tell you, Carol, how many letters I've received over the years from European mothers or fathers who have said, Brother Shane, thank you for what you've done to my son. I've had young men come to me racist when they came, but palatable and workable when they left. So remember, prison in Minnesota wasn't built for Black Minnesotans. It was built for Europeans.
Well, that's wonderful. It's a great way to end this. I want to thank you, Brother Shane, and really I want to encourage everyone to continue the series that we have coming up. We'll be posting the numbers and the events coming up as well. Please continue to tune into NPR and especially continue to read the Star Tribune, where our coverage of all of these issues, from George Floyd to the arts and to the critical role that the arts are playing in bringing a light and cutting through, as Reginald Dwayne Betts said, cutting through the ideology and the ice, the things that are frozen in place. So we'll continue that as well. Thanks to you, and thanks to all of you again, and good night from here.
Good night.